Connecticut, a state known for its rich history and picturesque winter landscapes, holds more than just holiday charm during Christmas. Beneath the snowy streets and festive lights lie chilling tales of haunted inns, ghostly cemeteries, and mysterious figures that emerge during the most wonderful time of the year. Tonight, we'll uncover 10 spine-chilling ghost stories from the Constitution State that will make you question what truly lurks in the holiday shadows. So, dim the lights, grab a warm drink, and prepare for a haunting journey through Connecticut's supernatural Christmas past. Story number 1. The Woman by the Fireplace at Wadsworth Mansion. The Wadsworth Mansion in Middletown, Connecticut, was the kind of place where history hung heavy in the air. Its grand halls and towering columns spoke of an era when fortunes were built on industry and extravagance. During the holidays, the mansion transformed into a scene from a Victorian postcard. Garlands strung along banisters, candles flickering in every window, and the scent of pine mingling with the faint tang of wax polish. But behind the festive cheer, there were whispers of something else, something the mansion's caretakers rarely discussed. It was said that the mansion was haunted, and on one Christmas Eve, a security guard named Evan Chambers learned that some stories have teeth. Evan had taken the job at Wadsworth a few months earlier. It was easy money: patrol the grounds, check the locks, and make sure no one sneaked into the mansion after dark. He'd always laughed off the ghost stories, chalking them up to overactive imaginations and the creaks of an old building settling into itself. But something about that Christmas Eve felt different. Snow had fallen earlier in the day, blanketing the sprawling estate in silence. Inside, the mansion was empty save for the decorations left behind after a recent holiday gala. Evan made his rounds, his flashlight beam slicing through the dim hallways. The grand ballroom was dark, its towering windows reflecting the pale moonlight. The library smelled of old books and cold air seeping through the cracks. When he entered the parlor, he felt it, a sudden drop in temperature, sharp enough to make his breath visible. The fireplace at the far end of the room was cold and dark, its mantel adorned with an elaborate arrangement of holly and ribbons. Evan adjusted his coat, muttering to himself about drafts, and continued on. The night dragged on. By midnight, Evan was back in the parlor, ready to finish his final round. But as he entered, he froze. The fireplace, which had been cold and dark just hours earlier, was now alight with flames. The logs crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows across the room. "What the hell?" Evan whispered. He stepped closer, the hairs on his neck rising. No one else was supposed to be here. The mansion's heating system was outdated but reliable. There was no reason for the fireplace to ignite on its own. As he approached, he noticed something else. A faint scent of lavender, sweet and cloying, hanging in the air. And then he saw her. She stood to the left of the fireplace, her figure illuminated by the dancing flames. She wore a dress from another century, its fabric heavy and intricately embroidered. Her hair was dark, pinned up in an elegant style, and her face was pale, almost translucent. Her eyes were fixed on the fire, unblinking. Evan's mouth went dry. He blinked, convinced she would vanish like a trick of the light. But she didn't. She stayed perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression unreadable. "Ma'am," Evan managed to croak. His voice sounded too loud in the stillness. She turned her head then, slowly, deliberately, her eyes locking onto his. They were dark and fathomless, and for a moment, Evan felt as though he were falling into them. The corners of her mouth twitched, as if she were about to speak, but instead, she stepped back into the shadows, her form dissolving like smoke. The room was silent again, save for the faint crackling of the fire. Evan didn't sleep that night. He finished his shift, his nerves raw, and left the mansion as soon as the morning guard arrived. But he couldn't shake the image of the woman by the fire, her dark eyes and the strange sense of sorrow that had radiated from her. He spent the next few days digging through the mansion's history. What he found only deepened the mystery. The Wadsworth mansion had been built in the mid-1800s by a wealthy industrialist named Thomas Wadsworth. His wife, Eleanor, was known for her beauty and grace, hosting lavish parties in the very parlor where Evan had seen the apparition. But tragedy struck one winter when Thomas fell ill and died suddenly, leaving Eleanor devastated. She withdrew from society, spending her days sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. She died less than a year later, on Christmas Eve, her cause of death listed as a broken heart. Evan returned to the mansion on New Year's Eve, unable to resist the pull of what he'd seen. The parlor was empty, the fireplace cold once more, but the scent of lavender lingered, faint but unmistakable. Some say Eleanor's spirit remains bound to the mansion, reliving her final moments by the fire. Staff members have reported seeing her reflection in the parlor windows or hearing the soft rustle of fabric when the room is empty. And every Christmas, the fireplace inexplicably roars to life, as if she's still there, mourning the life she lost. Evan no longer works at Wadsworth Mansion, but every holiday season, he tells the story of the woman by the fire, her sorrowful gaze, and the way she seemed to vanish into the flames. He's not sure if he believes in ghosts, but he knows one thing for certain. Some memories refuse to fade, no matter how much time passes, and some fires never truly go out. Story number 2. The Shadow in Devil's Hopyard. The Devil's Hopyard in East Haddam, Connecticut, was the kind of place locals didn't talk about after dark. By day, the forest was a picturesque retreat, waterfalls tumbling over ancient stones, trees that seemed to whisper with the wind, and trails that wound through dense, shadowed groves. But when winter descended, the beauty turned sinister, the snow muted sound, and the long nights cloaked the woods in impenetrable darkness. And every Christmas, the stories came alive. The shadow, a figure taller than any man, its eyes glowing a furious red, standing silently among the snow-laden trees. Those who saw it often wished they hadn't. December 24th, 1997, was a night of bitter cold. Snowflakes fell in fat clumps, blanketing the town of East Haddam in eerie silence. Mark Stevens, a local high school teacher, had agreed to drive his younger brother Ben to the forest. Ben, a budding photographer, had insisted on capturing the park's frozen waterfalls lit by moonlight. Mark, though skeptical of the plan, had reluctantly agreed. "You're not scared, are you?" Ben had teased as they drove through the deserted roads. Mark snorted. "Of a few trees? Please." They arrived at the park just past 10 p.m., the entrance sign partially obscured by frost. The forest loomed before them, the path leading into a tunnel of snow-covered branches. Ben grabbed his camera gear and bounded ahead, his enthusiasm cutting through Mark's unease. "Hurry up," Ben called, his breath forming clouds in the icy air. Mark followed, his flashlight casting long shadows across the trail. The cold was biting, each step crunching loudly in the oppressive silence. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They reached the waterfall, its cascade frozen mid-flow, forming crystalline columns that glittered in the moonlight. Ben set up his tripod and began snapping photos, muttering to himself about angles and exposure. Mark stood nearby, shoving his hands into his pockets to keep warm. That was when he saw it. First, it was just a shadow among the trees, a trick of the moonlight, he told himself. But then it moved, slowly, deliberately, stepping closer until it emerged from the darkness. The figure was impossibly tall, its form shrouded in a blackness so complete it seemed to absorb the light around it. Its eyes burned crimson, 2 points of unnatural fire that locked onto Mark with an intensity that made his stomach churn. "Ben," Mark whispered, his voice trembling. "Do you see that?" Ben turned, following Mark's gaze. His expression shifted from confusion to terror as he spotted the figure. "What the hell is that?" The shadow didn't move. It stood there, staring, its presence oppressive and otherworldly. Mark felt a cold sweat trickle down his back despite the freezing air. "We need to go," he said, his voice barely audible. Ben nodded, fumbling to pack up his camera gear. But as they turned to leave, the shadow took a step forward. The brothers broke into a run, their boots slipping on the icy trail. The forest around them seemed alive, the branches clawing at their clothes as if trying to pull them back. Mark risked a glance over his shoulder and immediately wished he hadn't. The shadow was following them, moving with a fluid grace that defied its massive size. Its eyes glowed brighter, cutting through the darkness like twin beacons of malice. The distance between them was shrinking. "Faster!" Mark shouted, grabbing Ben's arm and pulling him along. The trail twisted and turned, the snow obscuring familiar landmarks. Panic set in as Mark realized they were lost. The shadow's presence loomed behind them, an inescapable weight pressing down on their chests. And, just ahead, they saw it, the faint glow of the parking lot lights. Salvation! They burst from the tree line, gasping for air as they stumbled toward the car. Mark fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely fit them into the lock. Behind them, the shadow stopped at the edge of the forest, its fiery eyes burning holes into their backs. The car roared to life, and they sped away, leaving the park and its sinister occupant behind. Neither of them spoke about what had happened that night. Ben deleted the photos he'd taken, unable to bear the thought of seeing something he might have captured by accident. Mark tried to forget the way those eyes had seemed to bore into his soul, but the image haunted his dreams for months. Over the years, they heard similar stories from others, hikers, campers, even park rangers who spoke in hushed tones about the shadow in the woods. Some claimed it was the spirit of an ancient being, tied to the land long before humans arrived. Others believed it was a guardian, protecting something buried deep within the forest. But no one knew for sure. To this day, Devil's Hopyard remains a place of mystery and unease. Locals avoid it during the winter months, especially on Christmas Eve, when the snow-covered trees seem to hold their breath. Those brave enough to venture into the forest speak of an unnatural silence, a feeling of being watched, and the faint glow of red eyes in the distance. And if you're unlucky enough to meet the shadow, they say, it won't let you leave without leaving a part of yourself behind. Story number 3. The Lights of Lake Compounce. Lake Compounce, nestled in the rolling hills of Bristol, Connecticut, was America's oldest amusement park, a summer haven for families seeking thrills and laughter. But in winter, when the rides were silent and the gates locked, the park became something else entirely. The frozen lake, its surface gleaming under the pale moonlight, seemed to hold secrets as old as the land itself. And on Christmas Eve, those secrets stirred. It was December 24th, 1998. When Maggie Holloway first saw the lights, she had grown up in Bristol, her childhood summers filled with memories of Ferris wheels and cotton candy. Now 28, she had returned to her hometown after a messy divorce, renting a small house just a mile from the park. That Christmas, the loneliness hit harder than usual. Her parents had retired to Florida, and her siblings were scattered across the country. So, after a restless evening of staring at the blinking lights on her modest tree, she decided to take a walk. The air was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones no matter how many layers you wore. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she made her way down the quiet streets, her breath forming clouds in the still air. The park loomed ahead, its outline barely visible against the dark sky. A wrought iron fence encircled the grounds, the gates chained shut until spring. Beyond it lay the frozen expanse of Lake Compounce. Maggie stopped at the edge of the fence, her gloved hands gripping the cold metal. The lake shimmered in the moonlight, its surface smooth and unbroken. Then she saw it, a flicker of light, faint and distant, moving across the ice. First, she thought it was a reflection, the moonlight catching on something just beneath the surface. But the light grew brighter, its movements deliberate. It weaved across the lake in slow, looping arcs, as if following an unseen path. Maggie's heart quickened as she watched, her breath hitching in her throat. And then she heard it. Laughter. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the wind. But as the light drew closer, the sound grew louder. It wasn't the warm, joyful laughter of children on a summer's day. It was something else, something sharp and hollow, echoing across the frozen expanse like a taunt. Maggie took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to leave, but curiosity held her in place. She scanned the lake, her eyes straining to follow the light as it darted to and fro. It stopped suddenly near the center of the ice, hovering in place. The laughter ceased, leaving a silence that was somehow more unsettling. Then, the light began to grow. It expanded outward, a shimmering orb of blue-white radiance, until it was almost blinding. Shadows danced across the snow, their shapes strange and jagged. Maggie shielded her eyes, a cold sweat breaking out on her skin despite the frigid air. When she lowered her hand, the light was gone, but something else had taken its place. A figure stood on the ice, its outline faint but unmistakable. It was tall and thin, draped in what looked like tattered fabric that fluttered in the non-existent wind. Maggie couldn't make out its face, but she felt its gaze, heavy and unrelenting. The laughter started again, softer this time, almost as if it were coming from inside her own head. Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move. It stood motionless, its presence suffocating. Then, slowly, it raised an arm and pointed toward the edge of the lake, where the old boathouse sat half hidden in shadow. Maggie's blood ran cold. The boathouse had been abandoned for decades, its sagging roof and broken windows a testament to years of neglect. Kids in town told stories about it, about accidents on the lake, about people who went missing in the water and were never found. She'd always dismissed them as nonsense. But now, with the figure on the ice and the laughter still echoing in her ears, she wasn't so sure. Her legs felt like lead as she approached the boathouse, the snow growing deeper with each step. The structure loomed before her, its weathered boards groaning in the wind. She hesitated at the threshold, her heart pounding. The door was ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges. Beyond it lay darkness. Maggie swallowed hard and stepped inside. The air was colder here, the smell of damp wood and decay filling her nostrils. Her flashlight beam cut through the shadows, illuminating rusted tools and broken oars scattered across the floor. At the far end of the boathouse, something glinted in the light. She moved closer, her breath catching as she realized what it was. A bell. It was small and tarnished, its surface etched with intricate patterns. A length of frayed rope hung from its handle, swaying gently as if touched by an unseen hand. Before she could process what she was seeing, the laughter returned, louder and more distorted. The bell began to swing on its own, its chime piercing the air like a scream. Maggie stumbled back, her flashlight slipping from her grasp and clattering to the floor. The door slammed shut. Panic surged through her as she scrambled for the flashlight, her hands trembling. The beam flickered to life just as she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to her. They came from the direction of the bell, growing closer with each passing second. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a whisper, faint, guttural, and impossible to understand, filled the air, surrounding her, pressing in from all sides. She clapped her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face. And then the light returned. It burst into existence, flooding the boathouse with an otherworldly glow. Shadows danced wildly across the walls, twisting and writhing like living things. Maggie felt herself being pulled toward the bell, an invisible force dragging her across the floor. She clawed at the wood, her nails splintering, but it was no use. The bell swung faster now, its chime deafening. The laughter rose to a crescendo, a cacophony of voices that seemed to tear through her mind. Just as she felt herself slipping into the abyss, the light vanished. Maggie woke hours later, lying in the snow outside the boathouse. The first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon, the lake's frozen surface shimmering in the soft light. Her body ached, and her clothes were damp with melted snow. She sat up, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The boathouse was empty. The bell was gone. In the years that followed, Maggie rarely spoke of that night. When she did, her story was met with skepticism, dismissed as the imaginings of a lonely woman on a cold winter's night. But every Christmas Eve, as the townsfolk gathered by their fires and the lake lay silent under its icy shroud, some claimed to see the lights dancing on the water and hear faint, echoing laughter in the wind, and those who dared to venture too close to the boathouse never returned. Story number 4. The Laughter of Fairfield Hills. Fairfield Hills Hospital, once a sprawling psychiatric institution in Newtown, Connecticut, has long been abandoned, its halls silent but for the whispers of its tragic past. The stories of suffering and despair that occurred within its walls have given rise to countless legends, and few dare to visit the site after dark. Among the chilling tales, none is more unsettling than the one of Christmas Eve, a night when visitors claim to hear the ghostly laughter of children echoing through the empty halls. For Alex and Emma Price, Fairfield Hills wasn't just another ghost story. As amateur paranormal investigators, they had spent years exploring haunted locations, documenting strange occurrences, and debunking urban legends. When they heard about the laughter of Fairfield Hills, they knew it was a challenge they couldn't resist. "It's probably just wind or some animal sounds," Alex said as they parked their car near the overgrown path leading to the hospital. "But if it's real, this could be our best footage yet." Emma shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "Let's just hope we're alone out here. This place gives me the creeps." The hospital loomed ahead, its broken windows reflecting the pale moonlight. Snow fell gently, blanketing the ground and muffling their footsteps as they approached the main building. The air was still, and the only sound was the crunch of snow beneath their boots. The pair entered through a side door, the rusted hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. Emma turned on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness and illuminating peeling paint, broken furniture, and graffiti-covered walls. "This place is a wreck," she whispered, her voice echoing eerily. Alex set up their recording equipment, placing motion sensors and audio recorders in key areas. "Let's start with the East Wing," he said. "That's where most of the reports come from." The East Wing was colder than the rest of the building, the temperature dropping noticeably as they moved deeper into the hall. Their flashlights revealed rows of empty rooms, the remnants of hospital beds and chairs scattered like forgotten relics. Suddenly, a faint sound stopped them in their tracks. It was laughter, high-pitched and melodic. It drifted down the hall, soft at first but growing louder. Emma's grip on her flashlight tightened. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Alex nodded, his eyes wide. "That's not the wind," he whispered. He activated the recorder on his camera, focusing it down the corridor. "Hello?" he called out. "Is anyone there?" The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The couple exchanged a nervous glance before continuing down the hall. They reached a room at the end, its door hanging off its hinges. Inside, the walls were covered in faded children's drawings, the crayon lines smeared and weathered with age. Emma's flashlight flickered as she stepped inside. "These must be from when they had a children's ward," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex was about to respond when the laughter resumed, louder this time and coming from multiple directions. It sounded as if a group of children were playing hide and seek, their giggles echoing off the walls. Then came the unmistakable sound of running footsteps, light and quick, moving just beyond the room. Emma spun around, her flashlight sweeping the hallway. "This isn't funny," she said, her voice shaking. "Who's out there?" There was no response, but the sound of footsteps continued, circling them like a predator stalking its prey. Alex set his camera on a tripod, aiming it toward the hallway. "Whatever this is, we're getting it on film," he said, though his voice betrayed his nerves. Suddenly, the laughter stopped again, replaced by a faint whispering. Emma strained to listen, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers grew louder, forming words that sent chills down her spine. "Come play with us." The motion sensor Alex had placed earlier beeped, its light flashing to indicate movement in the hall. Emma grabbed his arm. "Alex, we need to go. Now." But before they could leave, the door to the room slammed shut with a deafening crash. The flashlight slipped from Emma's hand, spinning on the floor and casting wild shadows on the walls. The laughter returned, now deafening and layered with a sinister edge. Alex lunged for the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Help me," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. Together, they forced the door open, stumbling into the hallway. The corridor was empty, the silence oppressive. The motion sensor lay on the floor, its casing cracked. Alex grabbed the camera, and the couple bolted for the exit, their footsteps echoing through the deserted halls. Back at their car, Emma was shaking, tears streaming down her face. "What was that?" she whispered. "Alex, what did we just see?" Alex didn't answer. He was reviewing the footage on his camera, his face pale. The screen showed the empty hallway, but as the laughter erupted, faint shadows appeared, darting across the walls, and in the final seconds before they fled, the camera captured a single figure standing at the end of the corridor. A child, her face pale and expressionless, her eyes dark voids that seemed to stare directly into the lens. The couple never returned to Fairfield Hills. The experience left them shaken, their passion for the paranormal replaced by a deep fear of what they had encountered. The footage they captured became infamous, fueling the legend of Fairfield Hills and its ghostly children. To this day, visitors to the abandoned hospital report hearing the same haunting laughter on Christmas Eve, a chilling reminder of the spirits that linger within its walls. And for those brave enough to enter, a warning remains. When you hear the laughter, leave immediately, because the children of Fairfield Hills aren't playing games. They're waiting for someone to join them. Story number 5. The Haunted Room of Griswold Inn. The Griswold Inn in Essex, Connecticut, stands as a testament to history, its walls steeped in the tales of centuries past. Built in 1776, the inn has weathered wars, storms, and countless travelers seeking shelter from the elements. But beneath its warm glow and colonial charm lies a chilling secret. Guests who stay in one particular room often report strange occurrences. Whispers in the night, cold drafts that defy explanation, and the fleeting image of a man dressed as an old sailor sitting by the window, gazing out into the snowy night. The tales are especially prevalent on Christmas Eve. For Laura and Mark Caldwell, the Griswold Inn was the perfect getaway for their holiday weekend. The couple had recently moved to Connecticut and were eager to explore the state's rich history. The inn's reputation as a quaint and cozy retreat made it an obvious choice. "It's so charming," Laura said as they checked in. The lobby was decorated with evergreen garlands and twinkling lights, the scent of mulled cider wafting through the air. "It feels like stepping back in time." Mark nodded, admiring the antique furniture and framed portraits that lined the walls. The receptionist handed them an old-fashioned key and smiled warmly. "You'll be in room 17, she said. "It's one of our most historic rooms." Laura beamed. "Perfect." Room 17 was everything they had hoped for. A large canopy bed dominated the space, its posts intricately carved with nautical motifs. A small fireplace crackled in the corner, casting flickering shadows on the wooden floor. Heavy curtains framed a window that overlooked the snow-covered streets of Essex. "This is amazing," Laura said, setting her suitcase down. It's like something out of a storybook. Mark flopped onto the bed, grinning. This is definitely better than our apartment. I might never leave. But as the evening wore on, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. The cheerful crackle of the fire seemed to fade, replaced by an oppressive silence. Laura couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Do you feel that?" she asked, glancing at Mark. He looked up from his book, frowning. "Feel what?" "I don't know," she said, hugging herself. "It's just cold, like someone left a window open." Mark stood and checked the room, but everything was secure. "It's an old building," he said, shrugging. "Drafts happen." Laura nodded, but the unease lingered. They went to bed early, hoping to wake up refreshed for Christmas Day. The snow outside continued to fall, blanketing the town in silence. But Laura's sleep was restless. She awoke in the middle of the night to the sound of soft whispers. First, she thought it was Mark talking in his sleep, but when she turned to him, he was still and silent. The whispers grew louder, though the words were indistinct, like a conversation taking place just out of earshot. She sat up, her heart pounding. "Hello?" she called softly. The whispers stopped. The room felt colder now, the air heavy and damp. Laura's eyes were drawn to the window, where she saw a figure silhouetted against the pale glow of the snow. A man sat in the chair by the window, his back to her. He wore a dark coat and a tricorn hat, his posture rigid as he stared out into the night. Laura's breath caught in her throat. "Mark," she whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Wake up." Mark groaned, rubbing his eyes. "What is it?" She pointed to the window, but when he turned, the chair was empty. "You must have been dreaming," Mark said, though his voice was unconvincing. He turned on the bedside lamp, flooding the room with warm light. "There's no one here." Laura nodded, though she couldn't shake the image of the man by the window. She lay back down, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, they joined the other guests for breakfast in the dining room. The atmosphere was cheerful, with carols playing softly and the scent of fresh coffee filling the air. Laura tried to brush off the previous night's events, but curiosity gnawed at her. When the receptionist came by to check on their stay, Laura hesitated before asking, "Has anyone ever mentioned strange things happening in room 17? The receptionist's smile faltered. "Why do you ask?" Laura exchanged a glance with Mark. "I thought I saw someone in our room last night, a man, sitting by the window. He was dressed like a sailor." The receptionist's expression grew serious. "You saw him, then?" she said quietly. Mark leaned forward. "Who?" She lowered her voice. "We call him the captain. Legend has it he was a sailor who stayed here in the 1800s. He was waiting for news of his ship, but it never came. Some say he died here, heartbroken, and now he watches the snow, waiting for something he'll never see." Laura shivered, her mind replaying the image of the man in the chair. "Does he hurt anyone?" The receptionist shook her head. "No, he's just there, watching. You're not the first to see him, especially on Christmas Eve." The rest of their stay passed without incident, but Laura couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even after they returned home, the memory of the captain lingered, his figure etched into her mind. To this day, guests at the Griswold Inn continue to report sightings of the captain, his silent vigil a reminder of a bygone era. And every Christmas Eve, as the snow falls and the world grows quiet, those who stay in room 17 might find themselves sharing the space with a man who never truly left. Story number 6. The Haunted Melody of Dudleytown. Dudleytown, a forsaken village nestled in the woods of Cornwall, Connecticut, is infamous for its dark history. Once a thriving settlement, it fell into ruin after a series of tragedies. Unexplained deaths, disappearances, and whispers of curses that drove its inhabitants away. Now a ghost town, it remains shrouded in mystery, with stories of eerie phenomena drawing only the bravest or most foolhardy visitors. Of all its legends, none is more chilling than the haunting melody that fills the air on Christmas Eve. For Jason and Emily Winters, Dudleytown was a curiosity, a place they'd heard about in urban legends and late-night ghost story podcasts. They were avid hikers and amateur paranormal enthusiasts, always seeking the next thrill. When Jason suggested a Christmas Eve hike to Dudleytown, Emily hesitated. "You know what people say about that place," she said, sipping her coffee. "Bad luck follows anyone who goes there." Jason grinned. "Come on, it's just a story. Besides, wouldn't it be cool to say we've been there? Think of the pictures we'll get." Reluctantly, Emily agreed, though a sense of unease lingered as they packed their gear. The drive to Dudleytown was uneventful, the landscape growing more desolate as they neared their destination. Snow began to fall, blanketing the forest in a pristine, eerie silence. By the time they reached the trailhead, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. "We should hurry," Emily said, her breath visible in the cold air. "I don't want to be here after dark." Jason nodded, and they set off down the narrow path. The forest seemed to close in around them, the dense trees muffling their footsteps. The only sound was the crunch of snow beneath their boots. As they approached the ruins of Dudleytown, the atmosphere grew heavier. The remnants of old foundations and crumbling stone walls jutted out of the snow, silent witnesses to a forgotten past. Emily shivered, pulling her jacket tighter. "It's creepy," she admitted, glancing around. "Let's take the pictures and go." Jason snapped a few shots of the ruins, his camera's flash casting stark shadows on the stones. As he adjusted his lens, a sound stopped him cold. Music. First, it was faint, barely audible over the wind, a soft, melodic humming, carried on the breeze. Emily froze, her eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Jason nodded, his grip tightening on the camera. The humming grew louder, more distinct, transforming into a wordless tune that was both haunting and beautiful. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the empty village. "Maybe it's the wind," Jason said, though his voice lacked conviction. Emily shook her head. "Wind doesn't sound like that." The melody shifted, becoming more complex. It was as though a choir of unseen voices was performing a ghostly hymn. Emily's unease deepened as she realized the tune was not only beautiful but mournful, filled with an aching sorrow that seemed to seep into her very bones. "We need to leave," she said, grabbing Jason's arm. "Now." As they turned to leave, the music grew louder, almost urgent. The snow seemed to fall faster, the wind picking up and whipping around them. Jason stumbled, his flashlight flickering as he tried to find the path. The ruins seemed to shift in the shadows, the trees looming closer. "Over here," Emily shouted, her voice barely audible over the rising wind. She grabbed Jason's hand, pulling him toward what she hoped was the trailhead. Suddenly, the music stopped. The silence was deafening, oppressive. Emily glanced over her shoulder and gasped. Standing among the ruins was a figure, a woman in a tattered white dress, her hair flowing as if caught in an unseen breeze. Her face was pale and expressionless, her eyes dark and empty. Jason followed Emily's gaze and froze. The woman raised a hand, pointing toward them, her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, she vanished, leaving only a swirl of snow in her wake. They ran the rest of the way back to their car, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The forest seemed alive around them, shadows shifting and branches creaking ominously. When they finally reached the vehicle, Jason fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. They sped away, the headlights cutting through the snowstorm. Neither of them spoke until they were miles from the cemetery. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "That wasn't the wind, Jason." He nodded, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I know." Back home, they researched Dudleytown's history, Poring over old newspapers and online forums, they found countless accounts of strange sounds and sightings in the area. But one detail stood out. Every witness described the same melody, a ghostly hymn that seemed to mourn the village's tragic past. Some claimed the music was the voices of the dead, trapped in Dudleytown's cursed soil. Others believed it was a warning, a plea for the living to stay away. But one thing was certain: those who heard the melody were never the same. Jason and Emily never returned to Dudleytown, but every Christmas Eve, when the snow falls and the world grows quiet, they remember the haunting melody and the woman in white, and they wonder if, somewhere in the shadowed ruins of that cursed village, the music still plays, calling out to those who dare to listen. Story number 7. The Ghosts of New Haven Green. New Haven Green, the heart of the city's downtown, is a place where history and modern life collide. With its sprawling trees, carefully tended lawns, and picturesque pathways, it's hard to imagine the dark secret it holds. Long before it became a park, New Haven Green was a burial ground, the final resting place for thousands. Though the graves were relocated in the early 19th century, not all the dead were moved. Beneath the roots of the ancient trees, the remnants of unmarked graves remain, and some say the spirits do, too. On Christmas Eve, the green becomes a gathering place for holiday revelers. Twinkling lights strung on towering pines create a festive atmosphere. But as the night deepens and the crowds thin, the park takes on a different air. Locals speak of shadows gliding between the trees and whispers that seem to rise from the ground. This is the tale of what happened one Christmas Eve, when two friends ventured into New Haven Green and found themselves face to face with its haunted past. Megan and Riley had spent the evening hopping between Christmas parties, their laughter echoing through the chilly streets of downtown New Haven. By the time they reached the green, it was just past midnight, and the park was nearly deserted. "Let's cut through," Megan said, pulling her scarf tighter against the biting wind. "It's faster than going around." Riley hesitated, glancing at the rows of Christmas lights shimmering among the trees. "Are you sure? It's kind of creepy at night." Megan laughed. "Don't be ridiculous. It's a park, not a haunted house." Reluctantly, Riley followed her onto the path that wound through the green. The snow muffled their footsteps, and the festive lights cast long shadows that danced on the frost-covered ground. As they walked, a strange hush fell over the park. The city's usual hum of traffic and distant voices seemed to fade, leaving an eerie silence. Riley glanced around, his unease growing. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Megan stopped, frowning. "Hear what?" He tilted his head, listening. First, it was barely audible, a soft murmuring, like the rustle of leaves. But as the wind died down, the sound became clearer. It was a whisper, faint and indistinct, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. "It's probably the wind," Megan said, though her voice lacked confidence. She started walking again, but Riley lingered, his eyes scanning the trees. That's when he saw it. A shadow moved between the pines, slipping from one trunk to the next. It was humanoid in shape, but its movements were fluid and unnatural, as if it glided rather than walked. Riley froze, his breath catching in his throat. "Megan," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Look." She turned, following his gaze. First, she saw nothing, but then the shadow emerged again, closer this time. It paused beneath one of the Christmas trees, its form barely discernible against the darkness. Megan grabbed Riley's arm, her earlier bravado gone. "Let's get out of here," she said, her voice shaking. They turned to leave, but the whispers grew louder, seeming to surround them. The air grew heavy, and the festive lights flickered as if struggling to stay lit. Riley risked a glance over his shoulder and saw more shadows emerging from the trees, their forms indistinct but undeniably human. The friends broke into a run, their boots slipping on the icy path. The shadows didn't follow, but the whispers did. growing in intensity. Snatches of words reached their ears, fragments of sentences that spoke of loss, despair, and longing. Megan clutched Riley's hand, her pulse pounding in her ears. When they reached the edge of the park, the whispers stopped abruptly, gasping for breath. They turned to look back. The green was silent and still, the shadows gone. The lights on the Christmas trees shone steadily, as if nothing had happened. What the hell was that? Riley demanded, his voice shaking. Megan shook her head, unable to answer. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air. Without another word, they hurried back to their apartment, locking the door behind them. The next day, Megan couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She searched online for information about New Haven Green and found a wealth of stories about its haunted history. The whispers, the shadows, even the flickering lights, all had been reported before, most often on Christmas Eve. One account stood out. In the early 1800s, a caretaker for the green claimed to have seen ghostly figures wandering among the trees at night. He described them as lost souls, the spirits of those whose graves had been disturbed when the cemetery was converted into a park. They're looking for peace, he had written in his journal, but they find none. Megan and Riley never walked through the green at night again. The experience left them shaken, their holiday cheer replaced by a lingering sense of dread. But every Christmas Eve, when the snow falls and the lights twinkle on the towering pines, Megan remembers the whispers and the shadows, and she wonders if the spirits of New Haven Green are still there, searching for the rest they'll never find. Story number 8. The Ghost of the Yankee Pedlar Inn. The Yankee Pedlar Inn in Litchfield, Connecticut, was one of those places that felt steeped in time. Built in the 19th century, its sprawling brick facade and grand windows hinted at a bygone era of elegance. But for all its charm, the inn carried a darker reputation. Guests whispered of strange noises, cold spots, and shadowy figures glimpsed in the mirrors. And every Christmas, the stories grew more intense, with sightings of a woman in black haunting its halls. For Claire Sullivan, a travel writer in search of her next story, the Yankee Pedlar seemed like the perfect subject. She didn't believe in ghosts, but she believed in the allure of a good ghost story. So, on December 23rd, 2018, she checked into room 213, a room infamous among the locals for unexplained happenings. The first thing Claire noticed about the inn was its silence. Even with the holiday decorations, a towering Christmas tree in the lobby, garlands draped over the banisters, there was an oppressive stillness in the air. The receptionist, an older woman with a pinched face, handed Claire her key without meeting her eyes. "Anything I should know about the place?" Claire asked, trying to lighten the mood. The woman hesitated, then said, "Lock your door at night." Room 213 was charming but dated, with antique furniture and faded wallpaper. A four-poster bed dominated the space, its heavy curtains giving it a coffin-like appearance. Claire set down her bags and began unpacking, her thoughts already forming the first lines of her article. She planned to interview staff and guests, document the inn's history, and maybe even spend a few hours alone in the reportedly haunted basement. As she prepared for bed, the feeling of being watched crept over her. She brushed it off as nerves, the product of too many late-night horror movies. Still, she double-checked the lock on her door before turning off the lights. Claire's sleep was fitful. She dreamed of footsteps echoing down endless hallways, of doors creaking open on their own. She woke just after midnight, her heart racing. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the Christmas decorations outside her window. And then she heard it, a soft knock at the door. Claire froze, her breath catching in her throat. The knock came again, louder this time, gathering her courage. She got out of bed and approached the door. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. There was no response. She peered through the peephole, but the hallway was empty, telling herself it was probably a prank. She returned to bed, pulling the covers up to her chin. That's when she saw the woman. The figure stood at the foot of her bed, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light. She wore a long black cloak, the edges frayed and tattered, and her face was obscured by a veil. For a moment, Claire couldn't move, her body frozen in fear. Then she reached for the lamp on the nightstand, fumbling to turn it on. The light flooded the room, and the woman was gone. Claire didn't sleep for the rest of the night. She spent the early hours of Christmas Eve researching the inn's history, scrolling through old newspaper archives on her laptop. That's when she found it. A story about a woman named Eleanor Kingsley, who had died in the inn in 1893. Eleanor had been a guest at the Yankee Pedlar, waiting for her fiancé to return from New York. He never arrived, and Eleanor's body was discovered days later, hanging from the rafters in what was now room 213. Locals believed her spirit lingered, searching for the man who had abandoned her. Guests reported seeing her by their beds, her sorrowful eyes watching them before she disappeared. Others heard her footsteps pacing the halls, or the faint sound of weeping in the dead of night. Claire spent Christmas Eve interviewing staff and guests. Most were reluctant to talk about the hauntings, but a few shared their experiences. A housekeeper described finding furniture rearranged in empty rooms. A guest recounted waking to find the words "Why?" scrawled in the condensation on their bathroom mirror. By the time night fell, Claire's skepticism was waning. She considered checking out early, but the journalist in her refused to leave without finishing the story. She resolved to spend one more night in room 213. That night, Claire set up her camera on a tripod, pointing it toward the bed. She left the lamp on and sat cross-legged beneath the covers, her notebook in hand. Hours passed, the quiet broken only by the occasional creak of the old building settling. Around 2 a.m., the temperature in the room plummeted. Claire's breath fogged in the air as the sound of footsteps echoed outside her door. They were slow and deliberate, stopping just outside room 213. The doorknob rattled, and then there was silence. The camera's motion sensor beeped, drawing Claire's attention. She looked at the screen and saw it, the faint outline of a woman standing by the bed. Her heart pounded as she turned her head, but the space beside her was empty. "What do you want?" Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then, from the corner near the wardrobe, came a soft, mournful reply, "He promised." Claire didn't sleep for the rest of the night. She packed her bags before dawn and left the Yankee Pedlar Inn, vowing never to return. The footage from her camera was grainy but clear enough to show the outline of a woman in black, her face obscured, standing at the foot of the bed. The article she wrote became one of her most popular pieces, sparking renewed interest in the inn's haunted reputation. But Claire never told anyone about the words she'd heard, or the way the room had seemed to pulse with sorrow, as if the walls themselves were mourning. The Yankee Pedlar Inn still stands, its doors open to travelers seeking charm and history. But those who stay in room 213 during the holidays often report the same experiences. Footsteps, knocks at the door, and the silent figure of a woman in black, watching from the shadows. And if you're very still, they say, you might hear her whisper, "He promised." Story number 9. The Ghost of Lover's Leap Bridge. Lover's Leap Bridge in New Milford, Connecticut, wasn't just a landmark. It was a place where legends clung like frost to the iron railings. The steel arch stretched high over the Housatonic River, a silent sentinel to the tragedies it had witnessed. In winter, when the river froze solid and the world turned quiet under a blanket of snow, the bridge became a different kind of place. And at Christmas, the stories began to stir. They spoke of her, the girl in white, on Christmas Eve, 1986. Peter Halston trudged through the snow toward the bridge. He wasn't there for the stories. Peter was a reporter for the New Milford Gazette, tasked with writing a fluff piece about local holiday traditions. But the bridge's legend had piqued his curiosity. For decades, locals claimed they'd seen a woman in a white dress standing at the center of the span. her figure faint against the dark sky. She would stare down at the frozen river below, her expression unreadable. When anyone approached, she'd vanish, leaving only footprints in the snow. Peter didn't believe in ghosts. He was here for color, a spooky anecdote to liven up his otherwise dull assignment. But as he reached the bridge, a strange unease settled over him. The air was bitterly cold, colder than it had been moments earlier. His breath formed thick clouds as he stepped onto the snow-covered walkway. The iron railings were slick with frost, their jagged edges catching the faint glow of the moon. The town below was silent, the lights twinkling faintly against the dark horizon. Peter paused at the midpoint of the bridge and looked out over the frozen river. The ice gleamed like polished glass, unbroken and pristine. He pulled out his notebook, jotting down a few observations. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her. She stood at the far end of the bridge, her white dress billowing slightly in the icy wind. Her hair, dark and wild, framed a face that seemed impossibly pale. She didn't move, her gaze fixed on the river below. "Hey!" Peter called, his voice cutting through the silence. The woman didn't react. He took a step closer, his boots crunching in the snow. "Are you okay?" Still, she didn't respond. Peter's heart pounded as he approached, his breath quickening with each step. Something about her presence felt wrong, like a painting that didn't quite fit its frame. When he was just a few feet away, she turned to face him. Her eyes were dark and hollow, twin voids that seemed to swallow the light. Her lips parted slightly, as if she were about to speak, but no sound came. Peter stumbled back, his pulse roaring in his ears. Then, in an instant, she was gone. Peter stood there, his mind racing. The snow where she'd stood was undisturbed, as if she'd never been there at all. But the air still carried her presence, a sharp, electric cold that seeped into his bones. He left the bridge in a daze, his notebook forgotten in his pocket. That night, he tried to convince himself it had been a trick of the light or his imagination running wild. But when he developed the photos he'd taken, one image sent chills down his spine. The picture showed the bridge, its iron frame stark against the night sky. And there, at the center, was a faint figure in white, her face turned toward the camera. Peter's story ran in the Gazette the following week, sparking renewed interest in the legend. Over the years, he returned to the bridge many times, hoping to see her again, but the ghost of Lover's Leap Bridge remained elusive, appearing only to those she chose. Locals continued to share their own encounters. One man claimed he'd heard faint sobbing as he crossed the bridge late at night. A woman swore she'd seen footprints in the snow, leading to the edge of the railings before vanishing. And every Christmas, someone would report a glimpse of the girl in white, standing silently in the cold. The legend traces back to the late 19th century, when the bridge was newly built and the town was bustling with industry. The story goes that a young woman named Clara fell in love with a man her family didn't approve of. They planned to run away together, but he never showed. Heartbroken, Clara walked to the bridge in her finest dress, climbed the railings, and leapt into the icy river below. Her body was never found. Some believe she's still waiting for her lover, her spirit bound to the place where her heart was broken. Others think her presence is a warning, a reminder of the weight of despair. To this day, Lover's Leap Bridge remains a quiet, eerie place during the winter months. Those who cross it at night speak of the unnatural cold and the faint smell of lilies lingering in the air. And every Christmas, when the snow falls thick and the river freezes solid, someone, a traveler, a wanderer, or a skeptic will look out across the span and see her, the girl in white, waiting for a love that never came. Story number 10. The Bells of Union Cemetery. Union Cemetery in Easton, Connecticut, is a place steeped in mystery and whispers of the supernatural. Known as one of the most haunted cemeteries in America, it has long drawn curious visitors and paranormal enthusiasts. Among its many legends, the most chilling is the tale of the White Lady, a spectral figure who roams among the graves. On Christmas Eve, witnesses claim to hear the tolling of bells from the old church nearby, bells that haven't rung in decades. For Grace Porter, Union Cemetery had always been a source of fascination. A journalist by trade and a skeptic by nature, Grace had spent years debunking ghost stories and urban legends. When she was assigned to write a piece about the cemetery's Christmas Eve phenomenon, she jumped at the chance to investigate. "It's just another ghost story," Grace told her editor with a confident smile. "I'll have the article done by morning." Armed with a voice recorder, camera, and a thermos of coffee, Grace arrived at the cemetery just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was bitterly cold, her breath forming clouds as she stepped through the iron gates. Snow blanketed the ground, muffling her footsteps as she made her way toward the center of the cemetery. The first hour passed uneventfully. Grace recorded her observations, noting the eerie stillness of the place. The headstones, some dating back to the 1600s, stood like silent sentinels under the pale moonlight. The old church loomed in the distance, its steeple casting a long shadow over the graves. As midnight approached, the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, melodic sound. Grace froze, straining her ears. The sound grew louder, clearer. It was the tolling of bells, deep and resonant, echoing across the snow-covered cemetery. She glanced at the church. Its windows were dark, its doors firmly shut, yet the bells continued to ring, their mournful melody sending a chill down her spine. Grace raised her camera, filming the empty steeple as the sound filled the air. "This is Grace Porter," she whispered into her recorder. "It's midnight on Christmas Eve, and I'm hearing bells coming from the church. There's no one here, and the building has been abandoned for years." As she spoke, the air around her seemed to grow colder. She turned, her flashlight sweeping across the graves. That's when she saw her. The white lady stood near a cluster of headstones, her figure shimmering in the moonlight. She wore a flowing white gown, her long hair cascading over her shoulders. Her face was pale and ethereal, her eyes dark and hollow. Grace's breath caught in her throat as the apparition began to move, gliding silently toward the church. "Oh my God," Grace murmured, her hands shaking as she tried to steady her camera. The white lady paused, turning her gaze toward Grace. For a moment, the two locked eyes, and Grace felt a wave of sorrow so profound it brought tears to her eyes. The specter raised an arm, pointing toward the church before dissolving into the air, leaving only the faint scent of roses behind. Grace's heart raced as she approached the church, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The bells had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. She reached the entrance and pushed the heavy door open. Inside, the air was colder still, and the faint scent of roses lingered. She swept her flashlight across the pews, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. At the far end of the room stood an old, rusted bell pull, its frayed rope swaying gently as if recently used. Grace hesitated, her instinct screaming at her to leave, but curiosity won out. She stepped closer, her camera recording every detail. Suddenly, a gust of wind slammed the door shut behind her, plunging the church into darkness. Grace spun around, her flashlight flickering. The scent of roses grew stronger, and she felt a presence behind her. Turning slowly, she saw the white lady once more, standing beneath the bell pull. "Who are you?" Grace whispered, her voice trembling. The white lady raised her hand, pointing to a plaque mounted on the wall. Grace's flashlight illuminated the inscription, "In memory of Eleanor Harper, 1823 to 1848. May her spirit find peace." Grace felt a chill run down her spine. Eleanor Harper, the name was familiar. Digging through her memory, she recalled an article she had read about a young woman who had died tragically on Christmas Eve. Her fiancé killed in a carriage accident on his way to their wedding. Eleanor had waited at the church for hours, her heartbreak so great that she passed away that same night. The white lady's form began to fade, her sorrowful gaze lingering on Grace. The bells tolled once more, their sound reverberating through the church. Grace stood frozen, tears streaming down her face as the ghost vanished completely, leaving the room silent once more. The next morning, Grace wrote her article. It was a departure from her usual skepticism, a heartfelt account of what she had experienced. She included the story of Eleanor Harper, tying the legend of the White Lady to the history of Union Cemetery. Her piece garnered widespread attention, drawing both believers and skeptics to the cemetery. Some claimed to hear the bells. Others saw glimpses of the White Lady. But for Grace, the experience was deeply personal. Every Christmas Eve, she returns to Union Cemetery, standing among the snow-covered graves and listening for the mournful toll of the bells. And every year, she leaves a single rose on Eleanor Harper's headstone, a small token of remembrance for a love lost to time. From eerie lights on frozen lakes to ghostly figures in historic inns, these tales remind us that even during the holiday season, the past can return to haunt us. Which story gave you chills? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more spine-tingling tales and paranormal adventures. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, the ghosts of Christmas past may be closer than you think.